Welcome back. Today is chapter 23. So, away we go. The old woman wailed at the top of her lungs, her tear-stained face contorted with grief. Her knobby legs were unable to move quickly over the bumpy grass, and Mr. Marsh had slowed his gait to give her his support. Emma, seeing us in the driveway, waved over her head. "Help!" I hurried across the parkland with Jane, Mary, and Frederick behind me. "What's happened?" he yelled ahead. "We found her by the river in distress," said Emma. "The woman says her grandson has gone missing," Mr. Marsh yelled back. "Another young man abducted." Mrs. Runkle hugged her shawl around her shoulders. "He did not come home yesterday. I've been out walking for hours," she wept. Her whole body trembled with exhaustion. The lacy hem of her dress was torn in shreds, and burrs covered her shawl. "I can find no trace of him." By this time, our party had reached them, and she looked from face to face, pleading. "I do not know what's come of him. What if? "Bring her back to Northwich," I said. "Come, Mrs. Runkle, tell me when you saw him last." "I don't know," she faltered, limping, one arm still crooked over Mr. Marsh's elbow. "I suppose it was the day before last. He has been so strange since Earl's death. He leaves early and does not come home until late." "We must inform the mayor and the regiment," said Emma. "They can send out hunting parties." Goodness, that was the last thing I wished to see. 100 unprotected men marching into a battle that they could not win, engaging an enemy that would turn their minds inside out and fashion them into weapons against each other? Why not rip a hole in our reality and let the old gods return to devour us? For the residents of Dunham, the results would be the same: utter devastation. "Mrs. Runkle," I said, "do you know a place where Marvin and Earl like to go?" "Oh, I'm not sure," she panted, casting about for an answer. "He's always loved the heath. Perhaps he's there now. When he heard the regiment were tearing up the fairy stones, he was very upset. Perhaps. Her voice wavered, and she stared towards Northwich Hall as her face blanched. "I must sit down, Harriet, dear. I feel faint." We'd almost reached the steps to the front hall when the sound of erratic, shuffling footsteps caught my ear. I turned to look straight down the driveway, past the trout pond, and between the twin rows of trees. In the middle of the roadway stood Marvin, looking small, skinny, and starved. He dragged one foot behind him. His blonde hair was plastered with mud, he was naked and covered in sand, and his eyes were unnaturally bright, as if he suffered a fever. When he saw that he'd caught my eye, he sang a wordless melody, loud and clear. I was not the only one to notice his approach. "Take ease, madam, here's the scamp," said Mr. Marsh with good cheer. "Oh, Marvin," she cried out, reaching towards her grandson with tears in her eyes. "Do you know how you make me worry?" But I stepped between them. "Take her inside," I told Mr. Marsh, and turned my back on them to stride towards Marvin. He moved with an erratic purpose that was, by its conflicted nature, very bizarre. He jerked and stumbled as if under the influence of too much sherry, then shambled to the side of the road before lurching back into the center. I heard the others retreating up the steps, and from my peripheral vision I saw the kitchen door open and a familiar shape ooze down the steps, tumble over the lawns, and slip under the far side of the pond. As Nate was swimming closer, I felt a presence to my left. "I shall not let you face this devil alone again," said Emma, laying her light fingers upon my shoulder. I was much heartened. The center of my chest still ached from its claws, and I wasn't sure if I could survive its touch a second time. "Marvin," I began as we drew closer. "Marvin, can you hear me?" The boy stopped singing and cocked his head to one side like a bird. The unblinking eyes stared at me, and I stared back, bracing for the sensation of my reasonable mind straining under his magic. Emma called out, "Marvin, we're here to help you." "You can't heal him," I said to my sister quietly. "He's quite beyond our help." She stared hard at him and said, "No one is beyond help, Harry." Marvin gave a sharp, bird-like squawk. I stopped. Something is not right. We were only a few paces away. The pond lay to my right, and I heard the gentle swish of waves as Nate crawled to the near shore, his body black and slippery. "That noise," I said. "Mrs. Darling made the same." The naked youth stood in the middle of the roadway, and how I wished for the hermetoscope, to see through the veils of our limited perception to the truth of him. He shuddered all over. I braced myself for his transformation, but instead he threw out his arms and flung back his head, and then grabbed the sides of his mouth with each hand. He pulled, arms straining. I heard the moist tearing of flesh. "Oh, God!" Emma gasped when she realized his intent. We ran forward to grab Marvin around his shoulders and toppled him to the ground, struggling to pull his hands from his mouth. The cheeks were torn asunder, the lips ripped into a bloody maw, molars fully exposed. The flaps of his flesh flopped back like the petals of a garish tropical flower. Blood gushed from his mauled face, and Marvin gurgled and slurred as we tried to stop him, but he fought us with the vitality and determination of one possessed. His heels dug ruts in the driveway, his hips jerked and bucked, and the gravel rubbed his elbows raw. I saw the first hint of a creeping purple vine twisting and sprouting from the egress of his ear. Emma set her hands on that mutilated face, and Nate had wrapped tentacles around the boy's wrist to keep him from ripping the rest of his jaw off. I stumbled back appalled, but Emma was not so delicate as me. She wrapped her shawl tightly around the boy's head, keeping all the pieces together, ignoring the fluids that gushed over her hands. Blood pulsed and pooled in the roadway. Where it hit the dirt, I saw the ground shimmer like oil on water. I reached out one hand to touch the colors drawn to them. They were cold and sticky, tingling like pins and needles, and where the blood had hit the soil, small shoots of plants burst up through the dirt. Each was the delicate pink of baby fingers. What? The plants unfurled into blossoms. I gasped, for they were the flowers of the psychopomp's vision, which I suddenly realized had not been a threat, but a warning. The petals were soft, translucent flesh. The stamens were ivory teeth. The purple vines growing out of his brain began to wend around his convulsing body, sweeping over his frame like a blanket, burying their roots into his flesh and eating him alive. His emotions leaked through the blood, flowing raw and ragged through my hands. The sinister vines fed upon his frustrations, his desires, his lust, and they grew strong and supple on the twisted, curdled entitlements of a boy in his youth. Marvin's vitality and unfocused resentments provided the perfect fertile soil for the Eidolon's seeds. His spirit was as scarred and contorted as Mrs. Darling and Mrs. Rabbit, and I realized that he had stared deeply into the Eidolon's eyes, just as they had, and been destroyed from the inside out. But if Marvin had been able to look upon the Eidolon's face... I recoiled as I recognized my error. Sorry. "Oh, God," I said to Emma, "it's not him." A shriek erupted from the house. With the shimmering oil clinging to my hands, I bolted for Northwich Hall, leaving Emma and Nate to deal with Marvin. Inside, the ballroom was embroiled in chaos. I tried to take all in, from the gentleman in the portrait above it all to the waves of motion coming from every corner. Frederick stood at the far end of the room, and Mary stood beside him, her arms encircling him. She stood so that her body blocked the visions of madness from his gaze, but her eyes remained fixed upon the center of the room, and never had I seen such panic in her features. Jane, cowering against the wall by the servants' corridor, was screaming in terror, and at her feet Mr. Thorne lay sprawled across the ground, a gash across the back of his skull, with the cracked hermetoscope clenched in his hand. But the spectacle in the middle of the ballroom pushed all these elements aside. Mrs. Runkle had her right fingers wrapped tightly around Mr. Marsh's throat. Her fingers were skeletal and skinny, and her eyes were dark stars. Jane screamed again as the old woman plunged her left hand upward with incredible force, tearing through the soldier's body, driving her arm up between his hips into his intestines. He gave a sickening gasp. Then, as if rending a piece of cloth, she jerked open her arms, and Mr. Marsh was torn in two. The halves of his body, still twitching, fell to either side of the foyer. Confusion crossed his face as the life drained away, and his guts sloshed across the wooden parquet floor as if dumped from a barrel. The polished boots jerked, the convulsing hands flexed, then each portion slumped, empty and extinguished fully. I stared in mute horror. Mrs. Runkle turned to me and removed her bonnet with her blood-soaked hands, staring unblinking with those tiny, sinister eyes. The old woman shook and trembled like a dog dislodging fleas. Then she peeled off her dress to expose a swelling boil of a body. The antlers sprouted like saplings, branching outwards until they struck the gold chandelier like the chimes of tiny bells. The titanic Eidolon, servant of the scented garden, towered over me in the center of the dance floor. The bone-white face grinned and exposed hundreds of glistening needle teeth and licked its lips with its gray tongue. Emma cried out from the entrance foyer. Blinded by grief to the demonic force in the middle of the room, she ran past me to the nearest portion of Mr. Marsh and collapsed over him, cradling his head in her arms and sobbing. The Eidolon looked directly at me and whispered in a sing-song voice, It is time to unmask thyself, Harriet. Prepare the garden and water the roots. Be my Hyades and nourish the soil. It stretched out its fingers to entangle the ends in Emma's red hair. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to fight it, but the eyes burrowed into my bones. I could feel the heat of their gaze on the inner curve of my skull. My core was on fire, a spontaneous combustion spreading through my innards, invisible to the outside world. The eidolon clenched its fingers, and Emma squealed in agony, dragged backwards from Mr. Marsh's corpse. The glowing eyes never faltered. A manic, unrestrained joy crossed its face as it began to slowly twist Emma's head from her body. What could I do? Mr. Marsh was lost to us, and Emma would be soon too. I can't lie. The horror I felt at staring into those tiny, brilliant eyes was unparalleled. It did not blink. It did not flinch. The wicked smile inched wider and wider. A thump rattled the windows of the ballroom. Once, then twice, then a patter of bumps as tiny bodies struck the glass. Birds flew into the windows, and only then did the eidolon break its gaze and pause and look with anger towards the psychopomps, flinging their tiny feathered bodies as they sought a weakness in the house. It dropped Emma from its grip, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The mix of song and birds grew deafening. The cacophony rose in scope and size as thousands of black starlings pummeled the glass, but the break of the eidolon's hypnotic gaze freed me, and I looked towards Jane. She was trying to help Mr. Thorne to his feet, but her eyes were frantic. He stumbled, dazed and injured, but I feared he was more whole than either of them. Mary had fled from the room in terror. Frederick was stunned into uselessness by the sounds of the scene before him, and had curled into a ball, his arms thrown over his head. Emma, free of the eidolon's grasp, put out her hands to Mr. Marsh, and was drawing his halves together like a child trying to fix a broken doll. My heart wept for her. Her face was a mask of horror and grief at the loss of a life unlived, and a happy future she would never see. She gathered up his two halves and clenched them to her breast, his blood pouring across her white dress until it matched the hue of his soldier's jacket. Seeing that the birds could not enter, the eidolon returned its attention to me and shook its antlers, rattling the chandelier, stepping forward. It crooned soft words that stabbed into my eardrums like knives of black obsidian. I felt my body eaten alive by its words, as if every note was a little nibble, greedily taking more and more. Carnivorous plants chewed me, their roots burrowed into my muscles. Slimy fungi liquefied my body into nourishment. The scented garden was growing. It would feed upon the corpses of Dunham and spread like a blight over the countryside. And then, something quite unexpected happened. A second voice began to sing. I turned my head, feeling the skin of my neck crack with the effort, and saw Mary standing in the doorway between ballroom and entrance, holding Songs of the Scented Garden open in her arms. Of all the unspeakable parts of this eldritch scene, this was by far the strangest. She glowed with a phantasmagorical light. She grew taller, and her powerful voice reached down into the depths of the earth until its molten heart trembled. I'd heard her sing many times before with the village choir, but I'd never heard her sing like this. Mary's voice grew otherworldly as it ascended, note by note, into a clear, pure melody. It made the glass panes shiver, the walls shudder, and coaxed gooseflesh to my arms. The air stirred around us, reminiscent of the shimmering oil from Marvin's blood. It became a warp of light and vision, but also of sound and sense. How best to describe it? Our reality flowed. It frayed. It dripped down the walls and pooled on the floor. I saw through the sticky oil on my fingertips and the drips on the walls another universe. I witnessed men and women in other places, but I didn't recognize their clothes or surroundings. I couldn't process what they were doing or what they were saying, for it was so strange to my mind and foreign to my experience, I had not the vocabulary to describe it. My brain ached as I tried to comprehend the visions contained within the liquid reality, melting all around me. I heard a gasp and looked to my left. Nate stood before me, only he was no longer an octopus. He was no longer a man, either. He was shifting in and out of multiple realities, and in some he had read a cursed book, and in some he had resisted temptation. Here, in this liminal space, he was neither one nor the other, but only a set of eyes fighting to comprehend what was happening around us. Time took material form until our temporal journey lay thickly upon us like the layers of a cake, each moment visible and heavy, our multiple actions linked together with a net of intention. How does one describe the undescribable? My mind struggled to understand, tried to take in the entirety of Nate's form and function, but it was beyond my feeble, mortal comprehension. His eyes examined me with confusion too. What must I look like to Nate? I was not as I had been, nor what I could be. I was all that had come before and was coming ahead, future and past, a multi-headed hydra of possibility. Looking around the hall, the others had lost definition too. They were shades seen through gauzy curtains, dissolving and parting, sharing space without restriction. Only the Eidolon and Mary stood alone. She stitched multiple realities together as she sang words from a long-dead language, and in the center of her brow, the emerald eye blazed like a beacon. I stumbled across the room and snatched up the broken remains of the hermetoscope from the floor. Putting the spectacles on my nose, I cycled through the lenses over my right eye, until suddenly the ballroom was transformed. The hermetoscope gave form and definition to the layers, and through half of my vision I could latch onto solid forms between the shifting veils of perception. Long gashes in our reality were bursting open, fracturing to reveal distant landscapes of other worlds. I saw black plants with flowers made of fingers prying apart the floorboards, and vines of glossy pubic hair and glistening labia wrapping themselves tightly around the furniture. I saw arms, legs, ears, eyes, tongues, set like jewels along winding paths, where flocks of butterflies sipped at ocular fluid and puddles of rancid sweat. I saw hungry plants drawing life force from the scattered remains of Dunham's delirious victims. The ballroom was gone, replaced by a garden of living human atrocities, rooted into the bloody soil. Their tortured breath fed the fertile barrows. Through the rips, there were jungles, deserts, cities of stone and brass, creatures bound mercilessly tight in ropes made of still living flesh. Every rent in the fabric of our perception showed a different version of hell. The shipboards are bursting. The sea is rushing in. The Eidolon crept towards Mary, showing every indication of unrestrained joy at the destruction of our reality. It rode the warping world with a sense of glee. The flickering shade of Emma still clung to the wispy remains of Mr. Marsh, and Jane lay collapsed over Mr. Thorne. I looked towards Mary, afraid of what I might see, but the emerald eye rolled towards me, and in it I saw determination and a strength unmatched. She had not fallen to temptation. She had not resisted until she was too weak to fight. Mary had chosen to read, and by embracing her fate without fighting, she had claimed the song for her own. Mary had always been powerful and serious, and provided a stunning presence in any situation, but we had never fully recognized her quirk. I saw now that Posy's library had, over time, intensified her resolution and boundless fortitude into an angelic virtue. Her voice set her apart, and her courage in the face of the unknown was unrivaled. She was a scientist, after all. She ran boldly towards the unknown, and took joy in challenging the boundaries of knowledge. The emerald eye beheld the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Mary was incorruptible, because she sought the truths of the universe, and accepted the results without judgment or dismay. That eye, that fiery green sun, stared pointedly at me. Time was running short. The realities were laying one upon the other, and all versions of ourselves were compounding into single creatures, monstrosities of a million variations. The pillars are cracking. The building cannot hold. With every muscle straining, I picked up Thorne's cane and its silver head, and I thought of my father's words, and of Mr. Posy's confession. And with the hermetoscope on my nose, and one eye able to see in this world, and the other gazing upon the next, I knew what I must do. At the Eidolon's feet, a weak spot warbled in the wall under the portrait. Mary's song was pushing our reality too hard, and it had grown thin and frail. The spot undulated and pulsed, as glossy as a blister on the verge of splitting. The Eidolon had not noticed, for it was enraptured by her voice, and it paid no attention to anyone but her. The eye, staring at me, narrowed. "Be ready," it implored. I gave it a nod in reply. Defiant and steadfast, the Mary that was many Marys lifted the book. She opened it wide and took each half in a hand, and still singing, my sister effortlessly tore it in half. When the Eidolon screeched in horror, I lowered my head and ran. My shoulder caught the Eidolon in the gut. I wrapped both arms around its wispy body, and together we burst through the blister into another form of place, where the air smelled of dust and the wind blew hot and dry. We crashed down into a drift of gritty, rust-colored sand. Quiet. Still. The Eidolon thrashed under me, taking in our sudden change of surroundings with a blood-chilling screech. The desert sun was setting in a riot of magentas and oranges, and in the fading light I saw that the Eidolon and I lay in the center of a shallow box canyon made of red stone. The sandy floor of the canyon was barren and shadowy, but through the distant entrance in the direction of Dunham I saw lights twinkling and a phalanx of tall glass towers circled by iron birds. The buildings were festooned in garish lights as though a field of stars had fallen from the sky. In the gorge behind us, at the base of the cliffs, was a little hut made of ebony sticks, and around it were the unmistakable humps of 100 shallow graves. Plants covered with needles pierced the palms of my hands as I tried to stand. Tiny lizards skittered over my legs. The wind smelled of vinegar and brimstone, and I knew that I lay in the bowels of hell. The Eidolon stumbled to its feet, casting about left and right, winded and disoriented by the sudden silence. The hermetoscope had shattered into a multitude of brass fragments and glass shards, rendering the lenses useless. I held them to my face to discover that I was blind to any reality beyond the limits of my body's evolution. There was no way to see our path back. We were together in hell, the Eidolon and me, and there would be no escape. Before it could rise, I reeled back with the walking cane in both hands and swung hard, and brought the silver head down on the back of the Eidolon's skull. A moist crack erupted. The devil howled and thrashed, and the Eidolon's skeleton fingers scratched long lines in the sand, but I gave it no quarter to rally. Again and again I brought down the silver head, smashing at the bones and the antlers until they fractured into brittle pieces, screaming in my fury. Blood spattered over my dress. My arms ached, my legs cramped. At last the fiend lay still, face down in the dirt, its mask split open, and its skull crushed like an egg. The rag-wrapped body slowly deflated into the form of an old woman, moaning in pain. I dropped the cane. I hiccuped, held my hands to my mouth in horror. Mrs. Runkle looked up at me with confusion. Her expression was pleading through eyes swelling into purple orbs. She tried to speak, but her jaw had been broken in multiple places, and her teeth were smashed, and I recoiled, horrified at what I had done. "Oh, Mrs. Runkle," I said, shaking, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears streamed down my cheeks. A figure walked across the canyon floor from the direction of the hut, dressed in the tatters of a green dress and heavy leather boots. She looked as familiar to me as the face in a mirror, except that she was covered in bruises and missing her left eye. "Kill it," she commanded. I shook my head. "I can't. It's Mrs. Runkle. She was a friend." My other reality picked up the ebony cane and bounced the blood-spattered silver head in the palm of her calloused hand. "Harriet," she said, "you can't hesitate. Not here." She lifted the cane in two hands and brought it down hard to deliver the killing blow. I squeaked and covered my face and turned away to shield myself from the sight, but I couldn't hide from the wet sounds of bones cracking and brains mashed. When it was done, my other self lowered the cane. "The Mrs. Runkle you knew vanished when she read the book," she assured me. "Every story changes us, Harry. We're never the same person at the end of a book as we were at the beginning." Oh, how hollow and cold my words sounded out in this barren wasteland. I dragged my fingers over the hermetoscope's shattered remains. A million fragments of glass glittered in the sand, rose and azure and lime. The desert wind skittered over them, and in the final shaft of sunlight they sparkled like gems as the finest particles stuck to the blood on my hands. My other self, looking content, stared down at the remains of Mrs. Runkle. "How did you know I'd be here?" I said, grit catching in the back of my throat. "I killed Mrs. Runkle on this spot a few months ago," she said. "I've been waiting for the rest of me to arrive one by one as the realities line up." She rolled over the corpse with her foot, looking at it with disgust. "Didn't Humboldt tell you? Our timelines are misaligned." I couldn't answer it. I was still too winded and weak. "This isn't your place, Harry," she said, "and there's no way back." I saw her raise the silver cane again. "You know what that means." I nodded. Yes, I knew what she was about to do. But I didn't resist. I didn't blame her, because I would have come to the same conclusion. Both of us understood that I didn't belong here, an outlier and a liability, an anomaly that put all versions of our universe in jeopardy, and the longer I remained, the more unstable this place became. This brutal country was her reality, not mine. "I've done this before, Harry," she said, and her ruthless voice took the smallest measure of warmth, growing a fraction more kindly. "Every time the Runkle woman comes through, you do too. I've grown quick with all the practice." I fell to my knees, and I bowed my head, and tears tumbled down my cheeks until they dripped into the russet dirt and made little pockets of mud. I wept openly, but I didn't cry from remorse or horror or fear. These tears weren't from the grief I felt of never seeing Jane, Emma, or Mary again. No, they were tears of relief and joy. We'd saved the world, we'd saved our reality, and I would happily perish by my own hands in hell, knowing my sisters were safe. And it didn't matter that I was going to die, because they were going to live. "Are you ready?" she said. I nodded. "Go," I whispered. She took a deep, centering breath and wound back, stepping into the swing. Something tickled at my ankle. And then, as the silver cane fell, the tentacle wrapped once, twice, thrice around my calf, quick as a lightning strike, and yanked me backwards across the red sands, through the punctured blister covered over with molten air, between the gates of madness, from this accursed reality, back into my own. That's the end of chapter 23. It's a crazy one. I hope you enjoyed it. And, yeah, it's so bright in here. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back again tomorrow for chapter 24. Thanks so much for joining me. We'll see you later.